Welcome to the second part of my interview with illustrator and historian David W. Rickman. In this episode, we talk more about David's methodology for research and how he goes about understanding what people actually wore in the past. We get into some really interesting discussions about how Hollywood has taken over our perceptions of the American West, and also how much we actually don't understand about what Native people wore in the past. I also want to remind you that if you'd like to see the images associated with our conversation, you can watch the full video on the California Frontier YouTube channel. And with that, let's continue my conversation with David Rickman. So how much time do you spend at museums researching?
I've not been able to spend as much as I would like in recent years, but for a number of years, I was a visiting scholar at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles County. They have, beyond doubt, the best collection of clothing and artifacts. And I was there with a professional pattern maker named Sandra Altman, who has a company called Past Patterns. And for several years, every summer, we would go out there and spend, like a week going through the collection and discovering new things, correcting their records because they would have things that were misidentified, taking patterns off of some of the things. And that is the kind of work that I have done as much as I can. Living on the East Coast is a bit of a handicap, except that I do have a picture later on of me at the Smithsonian photographing one of the last known cueras, leather armor that was worn by soldados de cuera, although this one I have a feeling was made for a child. Nevertheless, I've been able to go to museums and where ever possible, looked at the things they have. I was just at the History Museum in New Mexico. They said I've been to the Whitty in San Antonio, Texas. I've worked with the DeYoung Museum. I think I know where most things are now. What I'm interested in this part of my life is finding out what hasn't made it into museums and what those might be. Every once in a while, you see a discovery that pops your eyes open. A few of the pictures that I'm going to have in my new book, Where Worlds Met, which we can talk about, a history of California costume from 1822 to 1860, are pictures that have never been published before, that were, if not unknown, they were very little known, and they never made their way into print. And I think it's going to start a lot of conversations. Well, a lot of conversations is a relative term in our small world, but it's going to start conversations about our assumptions of how the past looked, because it's not so much a matter of overall difference as a matter of depth, because we get more and more information. We know more and more about the small variations. One of them, if you look at the picture on the screen now of my La Purísima Mission State Historic Park, there's a picture of a vaquero on horseback, an Indian vaquero who worked for the mission. And that's actually based on a drawing that was done in the 1820s by a British naval officer in San Francisco. And so was the source of his clothing and horse gear. That's in the book that's coming up, which I've been working on for almost too many years, but it is coming.
Very interesting. In fact, I've been fortunate to see these in person, and who's ever watching or listening, if you haven't been to La Purísima, that's one of the great places to see David's illustrations up close and personally. And these are life size, right? These are human size.
Yeah. If you show me the next slide, Damien.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, those are the life-size cutouts, and it's kind of interesting. And forgive me, it's a little frustrating as well that early in my career, uh, just before I left to live on the East Coast, I was asked by La Purísima Mission to help design their costumes for their living history interpreters at the park. And so I had hoped that images like this and the work I'd done would change living history costumes in California. And they have to a certain extent, but to a great extent, they've not been able to break the Hollywood myths. And you see a lot of people wearing very different things, despite the fact that, even at the La Purísima Mission site, even though, a 5-minute walk across the lawn would get you a picture of what they actually wore, no one at La Purísima wears these things. They wear something that they invented for themselves. The last big project that I did with Living History was with Fort Ross during its bicentennial in 2012. And it was such an uphill battle to get anyone to wear authentic costumes that I just said, all right, I'll tell you what they actually wore, but I won't design these costume programs any longer because it's just too frustrating.
What do you think that is? Is it because the costumes, they may be too complicated or too intricate for people? Why do you suppose there's that difficulty?
No, I think it's a different attitude, Damien. We're getting ready for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution here on the East Coast, and I know several people, young people, who are involved with it. Well, people of all ages, but especially young people. And they take incredible efforts to do things right, getting the right fabrics, getting the right buttons, making the clothing themselves based on actual extant garments and such. And the best of them, it's kind of breathtaking to see just how good it is. But I think they can do that for a reason. I've long believed that the American West is our fantasy world. And it's the world that you project yourself into. And it's particularly appealing to people who want to be individualistic. The American Revolution is different. It was a group effort that people were working toward. And it's not about individualism. It's about a country coming together. The West is about striking out on your own, whether you're a mountain man or a cowboy or a whatever, and just living your own life and dressing however you wish. Trying to convince people west of the Mississippi that there are right and wrong ways to dress in order to interpret the past authentically is a real, for the largest part, it's very frustrating because they don't want to hear it. And I have actually shown up at historic sites in California, where I've designed the costumes, and someone will ask me who I am, and they'll say, "Oh God," and well, I hope you don't mind what I'm wearing. Just no, go ahead. Because
it's a California thing. Exactly. That makes sense.
Well, it isn't just California. You see it all through the West, but California. There's another aspect which I've talked about before. I think you and I have discussed, which is the idea that the Californios, after their crushing cultural defeat by the Americans, they began coming back, especially Southern Californians, toward the end of the 19th century, led by people like Antonio Coronel, and what I have termed the California Revival. And it helped to revive and tell us what the past was like. But then it went on, and as the generations who actually lived that life began to fade away, when Coronels and such died, the younger people wanted to romanticize it because it had been romanticized by things like Ramona and, later Zorro, that it fell out of being an authentic recreation of the past into this kind of golden age dream of what was, romantic and exciting. I mean, I've often called living history the perfect haven for fashion victims, because you go to events and the first thing they want to talk about is what's new and what's hot and what they can wear. Yeah, that's fine. And as long as you're not representing yourself as an authentic representation of the past, wear what you want. I mean, that's your right. But the problem is when they then say, well, I am. Well, the thing that I actually hate is first person living history, where they actually try and convince you that, against all the evidence, that they actually are a person from the past, when it's patently obvious that they are not.
I had an experience like that at Disneyland a few years ago, where, or maybe it was a couple of years, I can't remember, and we were with my children in the Star Wars area of Disneyland, and the young man there, I was trying to find out where the gift shop was, and he would not break character and admit that we were on Earth. For a moment it was fun, but after a while it really got on my nerves. I just want to know where the gift shop is, right? So
you just want to shake them,
right?
Come on.
But this illustration here at La Purissima that we're looking at now, what time period would that be?
That's about the 1820s. By this time, California was coming out of its starving age, which was 1810 to about 1822, after the supply ships stopped coming to California. And so they started being able to dress themselves again, as I discussed in my talk this year at the conference. And so this outfit here that this fellow wearing is based on several different sources, but particularly there was the Beechey expedition, a British naval expedition that arrived in 1826-27. And they describe in detail what the California soldiers were wearing. Now, I've added some details that are not mentioned. The cartridge box on his waist is not what most people think cartridge box is. It's actually a cartridge belt, I should say, called a canana. And he's wearing one of those. That comes from other research. When you actually read into the oral histories of the Californios that Bancroft's agents took down in the 1870s, they mention these. And you can also find it in the Reglamento by Felipe de Neve, saying, okay, this is what we're going to replace the cartridge boxes that were slung on your shoulder. These are much more convenient. And then there's this wonderful story, which I don't know whether or not I told. One of the California informants for Bancroft remembered some idiot shooting a fellow soldado de Cuera in the waist because he dropped his gun on the ground and it went off and hit the guy in the stomach. But luckily, it bounced off the tin tube that was in his cartridge belt. Well, based on that, okay, now we know what they wore. But it's small things like that that are gleaned over a lifetime of research, and it's what makes the difference of just kind of throwing something together and actually doing something that I look at and think to myself, well, that's the best I can do.
You must over time develop an eye for, I mean, metaphorically, even an eye for those type of details. To be reading a document and notice that he mentions that the soldier was protected by the tin in the cartridge belt, that sets off rings a bell maybe in your brain that, oh, I should take note of that. That in itself is probably a skill you've had to hone over time.
It's nice for you to make it sound like I did this on purpose, Damien, but I didn't. It's just after you read a lot and you have the kind of brain that likes to draw connections between one thing and another, Um, and I think I have one of those brains. I like different things like word origins and, oh, well, that's connected because of this root term and so forth. Surely you've done that all your life, I'm sure. Yeah. And that's one of the advantages of studying one time and place for a long period. Not that I can't do that in other parts of the American history. I've done a lot of that. But California, yeah, I can definitely do it. And um, it takes a lifetime of dedication and just wanting to know, um, wanting to see the past. I can still remember as a child being on a trip to Carmel Mission and still elementary school, standing in front of the what is now the Basilica at Carmel, and having this sudden realization, almost a tangible feeling of history, that, oh, people in the past actually stood where I'm standing. And I've had that several times since, not just in California, but elsewhere. But I think that was I know that was the first, and I think that was the most compelling experience I've ever had of that, of being able to have a sense of what the past, the presence of the past, even in the now. So yeah, I'm not sure I've answered your question, Damien, but I've gone off and talked about this kind of philosophy of experiencing the history both viscerally, but then also wanting to confirm what it was like by looking at real things and reading real things. I've often said that I could have gone into fantasy and science fiction, but they never drew me because none of that is real. It's exciting, but it's not real. This is exciting to me because it's real.
I don't know what it is, why in some places, some historical places, you get that, and some you don't. And maybe it's a very personal thing. It might be just the way somebody's attuned to a space. But that, to me, is one of the reasons that keeps me coming back to this area of study. And it's that tangible feeling. Other people have been here, have touched this, and in some ways, and I don't know why. Now I'm just kind of speculating. I don't know why that's the case in some places. I've been to Europe, and I've been in very ancient locations, Roman amphitheaters and temples, and there's certainly that as well. But there's something about certain missions here in California and maybe other historical sites where that is communicated more strongly than others, and I don't know why. But Carmel might be one of those, for example. Mm-hmm. So let's see.
May I ask you a question? Where did you grow up?
I grew up as a young man, we lived in the East Bay in Contra Costa County, right? And then we spent a few years in Pacific Northwest, and then came back as a teenager, lived in the Napa Valley, and then spent my time around there until I went away to college. So Northern California.
Yeah. And like you, I've traveled in Europe, and as a small child, I lived in Japan. But I think where we grow up is what gives us our ties, and why California does it for me, whereas Bronze Age Greece just never grabbed me. I like it. I'll be happy to go and visit the sites in Crete, but they don't speak to me in the same way. In the same way that I think that we respond to the landscape. We look at, I look at the rolling hills of California with the live oaks on it, and it breaks my heart because that says home to me. And I've lived on the East Coast for decades now, and it's beautiful, and it's got great museums and wonderful friends here, and my life is here, and yet this isn't my home. If someone was to ask me what my home is, it's California, because that's where I grew up. And it's kind of like those little ducklings that come out of the shell and attach to the first moving object, whether it be a dog or a human. We imprint on where we're from, and it resonates with us.
I think you're right. That makes a lot of sense, and it gives me something to chew on. And I'm going to think more about this, and maybe next time we see each other, we'll talk more about it.
I'd love to.
Back to this illustration, and you have others that we should and can get to.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What would you say the major change between a time period, say the 1820s, and then later other time periods that you've depicted, say the 1840s or in California? Were there major changes in clothing and dress in that time period prior to the American arrival?
Oh, Damien, you just pitched me a softball. Yes, indeed. That's an important point, and in two ways. The first way is that in 1834, when the Hija Padres colony came from Mexico, the idea being that they were going to bring in new skills and people were going to modernize California, they just happened to also bring new fashions in. California had been very isolated, both by land and sea, from Mexico. And so the new fashions, which came in with the 18 teens with the wars against Spain, included the long trousers, the calzoneras, more military-looking jackets, women's dresses, which had been in California earlier, but the particular styles of dresses came in the 1830s and 40s. And so there was a real change. The second part of the equation, though, is that just as we today, as gentlemen of a certain age, do not look to the latest teenage fashions and copy them, we wear the clothing that we have worn for years and feel comfortable in. In early California, eyewitnesses tell us that poor women and women of a certain age did not adopt the new dresses. They continued to wear the blouses and skirts that they had known, well, that the poor people can afford, and that the older women of higher status had known as girls, and they are going to continue to wear those for most of their lives. In the same way, you read the eyewitness accounts and see the eyewitness pictures, and you see older men continuing to wear breeches right into the American period. And there's one description from the 1840s of an older man in California wearing his hair down to the middle of his back in a braid. Not many people realize that California men up into the 1830s generally wore their hair exactly the same way that women wore it, which was in a long braid down their back. So, yes, new fashions come in, but whenever I see pictures of white-haired men or see men of my own age or anyone over 40 reenacting early California, and they're wearing calzoneras and braided jackets and such, I'm saying, it's as if you were dressed like your teenage son or grandson. You're the wrong age to wear that. You're the wrong age. So that's a two-part answer to your question.
So we talked about Spanish, Mexican, Californians. What about native people? How did what kind of misconceptions do we generally have about how native people, Indians, dressed in the early period prior to U.S. statehood?
Well, I mean, years ago, I gave a talk for the California Missions Conference called "To Clothe the Naked." And it talks about how the mission padres needing to dress the Indians, who California traditional clothing for men was no clothing, and for women, a skirt. And too much can be made of the idea that, this shocked the sensibilities of the Spanish. They weren't shocked in the least. There are eyewitness pictures from the La Perouse and Malaspina expedition, the padres and soldiers and all standing casually and talking to half-clad women. No big deal. They're used to that. Nevertheless, if the idea is to bring them into Spanish society eventually and make them fully fledged Spaniards, and then later fully fledged Mexicans, then you want to get them into clothing. That's a sign of progress in civilization. That's my interpretation of the situation. And so you get Father Mariano Payeras, for example, writing back to his college saying, can you buy me scrap fabric? Any kind of scrap fabric, bolt ends, whatever, and send them to me because I can make clothing for these people. Well, probably what he's talking about is not clothing for the neophytes generally, the people who had not been at the mission long, had not acquired skills. He probably was talking about a certain class of elite neophytes, those who had skills or were useful in other ways to the Padres. And they were the people who were entitled, from their point of view, to dress more like a Spaniard. And you get the eyewitness accounts from the missions of people saying, well, I dressed the vaqueros, and those who didn't have any skill, they just rode in their breech clout without a saddle. Those who had the skills, we dressed head to toe exactly like a Spaniard. And so what we have gotten wrong, I actually trace back to the works of Father Zephyrin Engelhardt. I don't know why he did it. I cannot say, but he mistranslates the eyewitness descriptions that came from the Padres interrogatorios, the ones that they had to send back to Mexico City to explain what they were doing for the neophytes. And they very clearly say, we dress the men in a coton, a shirt, and a breech clout. And for whatever reason, not only did Father Engelhardt translate that as we dress the men in a suit of cotton clothing, when coton is not Spanish for cotton. Even worse is that some of the Padres explain what a coton is. He says it is a woolen shirt. And yet Payeras rode right over that and said, we dress them in cotton suits, which was kind of hard to explain why they also issued them breech clouts, which is also in his translation. But not only did he do that, but he had two artists, one of whom was Alexander Harmer, whom I mentioned earlier, illustrate the books. Now, Zephyrin Engelhardt had served in Mexico. Alexander Harmer had been a cavalryman in Arizona and New Mexico. And he knew, white cotton-clad Native Americans were a common sight for both men. And so somehow all the illustrations to Engelhardt's books show these Indian men and women wearing white cotton clothing. Well, that ended up in the movies, and that ended up in murals and paintings. And it has absolutely nothing to do with what the neophytes wore. And now I see it being used as a standard dress, whether the illustrators working in Texas or New Mexico or Arizona, they all show their neophyte Indians wearing these white cotton clothing. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. That was just something that Zephyrin Engelhardt, for whatever reason, created.
And Engelhardt was the Franciscan historian who wrote that multi-volume history that many people still rely on for the history of the mission.
And rightly so. It's a remarkable work. I can be a nitpicker. God knows I am a nitpicker. Herbert Bolton is a wonderful historian who did something that When I traveled the Anza Trail, I did it in a car. When he traveled the Anza Trail, he did it on a mule or on a horse, depending on what he had that day. I didn't do that. He wrote the best books, foundational books, I should say, on the Anza expedition. Nevertheless, when he translated that supply list, he took the term zapato abotonado and translated it as button-sided shoes. Well, abotonado is not button-sided. It means ankle boots. So we know what ankle boots were, but that's not what he wrote. Well, it's gone into countless versions online and elsewhere that these people were wearing button-sided shoes. Does that in any way negate the importance of Herbert Bolton as a terrific historian? I mean, when I was at Berkeley, he was practically a god there. That was his campus. No, it doesn't. It just means that people like me come in afterwards and kind of sweep up the mess and try and tidy up the record and say, no, Herbert, you're a great guy, but those were ankle boots. Those weren't button-sided shoes.
Right. Those are details that don't really mar the value of the work.
Absolutely not.
So that does it for the second part of my interview with David W. Rickman. In the next segment, I'll have the final part of our interview. So I hope you will join us for that. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.